welcome everyone to our first session of Gurdjieff Unveiled. We're doing an 8-week study on the principles of G.I. Gurdjieff, and we're studying the book that is your free download, Gurdjieff Unveiled by Sy Ginsburg, Seymour Ginsburg. Your facilitators are myself, Gwen Mayer, Sy Ginsburg, and Harry Gray. And I'm going to turn this over to Sy to just introduce ourselves.
Okay, hello everyone. And this is Gurdjieff Unveiled. My name is Sy Ginsburg, or Seymour Ginsburg. And just a few things about me. My own experience as I came in touch with Gurdjieff in 1978. At the same year, I came in touch with Theosophy, and have been a student of both ever since. I have two mentors. I'll talk about them a little bit. Nicholas Tereshchenko, who was responsible for the predecessor book that he and I put together. And the reason we put it together was because in-person classes on Gurdjieff that took place down in Florida, where I live, and I live in Boca Raton, Florida, people would come into the Gurdjieff study group, and we're going to talk about what goes on in a Gurdjieff study group, but they would not necessarily know about the principles behind the teaching. So what we hope to do with this book is to talk about the principles, and then for those who are interested, we have ongoing Gurdjieff study groups, because the Gurdjieff study is a very long-term study, and we'll explain why as we go through this. So Nicholas Tereshchenko is no longer with us. He and I both knew we needed a revision of that first book. He passed away in 2002, and this book was published originally in 2005. My other mentor was Sri Madhav Ashish. Turned out he was an Englishman who lived in an ashram in the Himalayas. I was attracted to him because of the stanzas of Dazan, the basic material upon which modern theosophy is based. So that's just a little background about my mentors. Just a couple of other things. It's important that you download the book. The actual printed copy has gone out of print, although it's available in French now. But it looks like this, like what's up on the screen. However, you don't need to buy anything. Just go on the Theosophical website. You don't have to print it out if you don't want. You can download it, and everything we're going to talk about pretty much is going to be in this book. And it's in kind of an outline form, and we're going to go through it that way. We're going to take turns explaining these principles as we understand them, and pretty much going in an outline form as the table of contents of the book. So I will come back to this, and I have some more introductory remarks, but I'd like to turn this over to Harry, the co-facilitator, to introduce himself, and then Gwen to introduce herself. So over to you, Harry.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. My name's Harry Gray. I live in Lewiston, Maine. I'm a retired registered nurse, and currently what I call myself now is a freelance writer and independent filmmaker. I became interested in the Gurdjieff work in 1976. My mentors were Ermes B. Popov, who was Mr. Ouspensky's personal secretary in the 1940s when he was here in the United States, and the late Dr. Keith Buzzell from Maine, a neighbor of mine actually, and who was one of the greatest, who had some of the greatest insights into Gurdjieff's book called All and Everything, and wrote extensively about it. I've participated in webinars once or twice before, and I'm participating in one other internet group here in Maine when I can't make it physically to the group. So that's what I am doing at the moment, and I'm glad to be here as a co-host, and I look forward to a lot of interesting discussions. Thank you. And Gwen.
Thank you, Harry. I got involved with the Gurdjieff people back in the 70s. I kind of gave up my study after probably in 1985 and regained my connection to the Gurdjieff Fourth Way movement and practical work. I'm a therapist, I'm a psychologist, and an educator. And I have found that Gurdjieff's work is very helpful in practical teachings, and that's how I use it. And my aim in this group is to make this practical for everybody. So if you find that you're sitting there trying to think about what this is all about rather than how we practice it, which is what the work's all about, then I want you to make it practical for yourself. What we're doing is we're coming up with the basic ideas of Gurdjieff's work as the book relates to it, and I would love for y'all to read ahead. Each of us, like Sy, is going to start out with the first couple of things, but it's going to be important that you read ahead and see if you have any questions, because we're not going to read this to you. So, Sy, I'm going to let you get started with this.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm going to skip around a little bit, really, with the first 5 parts of Lesson 1. And it is important that you download the book. As Gwen says, we're not going to be reading the book word for word. We'll read certain things, but at least you'll have an idea. So please download it. And at the end of today's session, Gwen will give you an instruction of what pages to read in the book, along with an exercise. But going back to the preliminary ideas, in the prefaces of the book, you'll find a warning that Gurdjieff gives. It's a quotation from his great book, mentioned by Harry All and Everything, and the first part of that is called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. It's generally not read by people new to Gurdjieff's teaching, although you're welcome to try it. Most people come in touch with the textual material through someone else also mentioned, Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, an excellent book. So if you want something beyond the introductory material that we're going to talk about here, I would highly recommend In Search of the Miraculous. It's widely available. The warning that Gurdjieff gives, and you'll find it in the prefatory material of the book, comes from Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. So I'm going to quote this. Blessed is he that hath a soul. Blessed also is he that hath none. But grief and sorrow are to him that hath in himself its conception. And it's repeated in slightly other words in another book of Gurdjieff's aphorisms, Use in the Real World. The reason is that what we're going to talk about, at least as I understand it, is that most of us have been conditioned from early childhood into one religion or another. Gurdjieff said that all religions at their heart are the same. And my own experience is the ones I've examined, which are Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. He's correct, at least of what I could find out. The problem is that most of us are not exposed to the inner or esoteric teachings of our religion. I was not, and consequently, the story I was given was about a separate Mr. God. And if I was good, I'd go to heaven. If I was bad, Mr. God would send me to hell. Now, that's pretty simplistic, but there's an awful lot of religious teaching on the surface that talks about that. But if one digs a little further into whatever religion it is that you were raised in, you will find that that's not really how it is. How it is, and this has to do with Gurdjieff's warning, is that we're introducing here a new idea, if you haven't heard it before. And some people would say the idea is blasphemous, but that idea is that there is no difference between you and the divinity. And that's why Gurdjieff says, blessed is he that hath a soul, and blessed is he that hath none. His word for soul or the divinity was endlessness. And so these teachings are an effort to move our identity out of this personality with which we've been learned to be frightened or be glad, but it's our personality. When we can move our identity to something more real in us, which Gurdjieff called essence, then all of that stuff falls away. So the practical Gurdjieff work, as I understand it, is this work that we do through self-observation week after week based on exercises or tasks that have been developed over the years that helps us move our identity out of the personality and into essence, or soul, if you like, or endlessness, if you like that better. So this is the basic warning, and why it's a warning, and I hope I'm explaining it adequately. Because the next part of it, Gurdjieff says, in a certain sense, we're all asleep. He called us sleeping humanity, and we're identified with this. He called us these things we live in, machines. This is a machine that I live in, and you live in. It has a physical component, has a mental component, has an emotional component, but none of that is real in the objective sense. It's almost like an automobile, and as it gets old, like mine has gotten old, I'm 84, it's like a used car. You keep fixing it up and repairing it. However, that isn't who we are. So it's important to understand that, and whether you buy it or not, that's up to you. But that's what Gurdjieff meant by sleeping humanity. We think we are the machine. We're really something much greater than that he called endlessness. So there are two basic questions that anyone approaching these ideas usually asks in one form or another. You've probably asked them yourself, otherwise you wouldn't be interested in this sort of teaching. And these can be summed up as Gurdjieff's questions. J.G. Bennett, another student of Gurdjieff's, called them Gurdjieff's questions. But they're questions we all have. I certainly know I had it. The first question is, who am I? And Gurdjieff tries to answer that by explaining that because of the sleep state, I didn't know, or I don't know, that I am not this machine in which I live. And the second question is a little more problematic, is what is the purpose of human life, or of my life in particular? And there are various answers to this. My current answer, at my level of understanding, is that the purpose of this, because Sy, or whatever is the essence in Sy, is endlessness, or the divinity, if you like. And through all of these exercises, these self-awareness exercises, we become conscious of who we are. And so that's my current answer to the second question, what is the purpose of my human life? So those are just some very basic ideas. You'll find them in lesson 1 of the book. But I'm going to stop there and turn this over to either Harry or Gwen, who maybe would like to comment on any of this.
First, I'd like to go over the personality and essence, because that is basically what we're learning when we observe. The biggest lessons I've learned in observation, and that is day-to-day observation, hour to hour, minute to minute, is to learn the difference between when your personality is acting out of its machinery and when you are in a state of objectivity or you're connected to the higher essence. And one of the things that happens is that for each of us, we have to verify these things for ourselves. To know when you are in your personality, you are acting pretty much by rote, by things that you do. And you have to not so much judge what you're doing, but look at yourself. Like you're watching yourself from your own camera, doing what you do, following your habits. We call these our small eyes. And then we have a connection to a higher essence, higher in the sense, and we will go through that at length in this class, that is a larger I. It has more of a witness. We're witnessing from a much higher place. So we go through this every moment of the day where we are seeing our mechanical self go forward. We have to eat, sleep, drink, the whole thing. However, in the Gurdjieff work, meditation and sittings become very important in order to get in touch with essence. And we will go through that through the class. So I really want you to consider when we start the exercises, which we will this time, to watch out of where you're reacting from your personality or from essence. And we will, again, go through it over and over. So I put these things up here for you to look at. Our essence is what we're born. A child born, when we're babies, we are born into essence. We come into this body in our duality, and we have to face up to the fact that we become human beings on this planet, but we carry this great essence with us. When Sy was talking about being raised where, there was a Mr. God and everything, we've all been conditioned from birth to believe and act a certain way. But if you can remember back in your childhood, you were much happier then. You were much freer to learn and to discover. And we're kind of wanting to return to that level with observation. So because you were part of essence. So we get conditioned, and we will talk about that too. We get conditioned to believe a certain way, to think a certain thought, to act a certain way, and that becomes very much part of our personality. Not that it's bad, it is part of our conditioning, but we learn the difference between conditioning and essence and listening to our higher self. So, Harry, I'm going to turn this over to you regarding the fourth way.
None of you would be here if you were not seekers of the truth. And one day you came upon the teachings of Gurdjieff and something called the fourth way. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the first three ways? There is, most traditions, three ways corresponding to each tradition. The fakir, F-A-K-I, is usually associated with an Indian, the Indian who often lays down on a bed of nails, eats glass, stands on his hands with his body raised up off the ground in the lotus position. That represents the physical aspect in the body of the first way. And and this fakir attains such extraordinary control over his body at the expense of his other two centers, the emotional and the intellectual. And it's usually based upon imitating other fakirs. The second way is called the way of the monk, or the emotional center. That's easier to comprehend as where we talk about religions, and some of us belong are part of a particular religion, and they are they attain an emotional contact with their being, and they depends on the intensity of the work on the emotional center. They can become conscious, but it takes a long time. As well as the fakir, they do obtain that stage where they can become conscious at the expense of the emotional and the intellectual center. And the third way is the way of knowledge. You can perhaps, the only thing I can think of at the moment is through studies of many different religions, many sciences, many other ways. But we're still hungry. We are still not satisfied. And then one day we come across, for example, Gurdjieff's teaching called the fourth way. What this is a balance of the other three ways, the first three ways. And this fourth way, you're attracted to it because it touches upon your first, the physical center, the emotional center, and the intellectual center. In my own life, for example, when I was a teenager, I took up karate because I was not interested in sports, but I wanted some discipline on my body and on my emotions. And so I learned how to go through the motions and defend myself and have control over the body. I did not do that just to learn self-defense. I wanted to do it as a sport and have control and discipline over my body. Later, on the emotional center, I was searching and trying to understand different religions. Which religion is right? Which one is right for me? A lot of them appeared different to me at the same time. I joined a couple of churches, but nobody seemed to really know or satisfy my questions as to what I wished to know, which was the meaning of life. And then I studied with the intellectual center, the different religions, different ways, different New Age teachings. And then one day I came across the fourth way, and that had attracted me very strongly because it touched upon immediately the first three centers. And when something like that touches upon your first three centers, it touches on the self as a balanced person, a being. And you almost say immediately yes to all this. And that is basically the definition of the fourth way. You do not have to give up your religion. You do not have to give up your intellectual center because we're always studying. And we have to know the body, so we do not give up the fakir way on becoming more disciplined and knowing how the body works. So the three ways that are in balance is called the fourth way. We don't ask anyone to give up their religion, but there's another aspect between religion and the fourth way that has to be looked upon. There are 5 major religions, I think, in the world. They all appear different on the surface, but underneath they have like a golden thread, and it's the same thread that intertwines with all the other religions, and is the truth that's beneath it. It's the esoteric aspect of Christianity, the esoteric part of Buddhism, the esoteric part of Judaism, the esoteric part of the yogi, the monk, the physical aspect. And a lot of these people that are in these ways, they're not familiar with the esoteric components of their ways, of their religions. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's something that's certainly very, very necessary. One who has been in the fourth way for a very long time studying Gurdjieff's teachings, which is also called, in essence, the esoteric Christianity, because there are strong similarities and correspondences between each. And when one has been in the fourth way for a very long time, that one could very easily know a lot more about the religion than the Catholic priest. I've had discussions with several Catholic priests, and they were either keeping silent about the aspects of what they understand about esoteric Christianity, or they did not know. But I could not really engage them in a conversation that I was trying to direct. So that, in essence, or that is really what it means to be the fourth way. It's a way in life. We cannot become a monk. We cannot become scientists in the educational curriculum type school, so to speak. And we cannot sit on a bed of nails or eat light bulbs or things like that. Well, it's what it is. It's a way in life. And it's a different way from the others because of that. People can be in life and work in life from there as a monk and as an intellectual, but they're not able to work in the way that builds upon what they already know and understand to make their being grow. That's
Harry, I wanted to bring up you brought up the esoteric quality. The meaning of esoteric is inner, the inner work. So all of these religions, if you know people that their religion is outside of them, Catholic priests or Jewish rabbis or whatever, it's all about outside of them, not inner side. So you're looking at esoteric in any of these religions as owning this inside of oneself. And the fourth way is all about going inner to the inner work and doing inner exercises. That's where the observation comes in.
Gwen, I've got a couple of things I'd like to add. There's a part of the first lesson or first chapter called Beginning the Quest. And then there's a quotation from a talk that Gurdjieff gave. It meant a lot to me, this talk. Some of you who are maybe astronomy minded or even astrology minded, it will be useful. I'm going to read it out. Here's what Gurdjieff tells us to do, and this is not the exercise for the week, but he suggests this. Go out on one clear, starlit night to some open space and look up at the sky as those millions of worlds over your head. Remember that perhaps on each one of them swarm billions of beings similar to you or perhaps superior to you in their organization. Look at the Milky Way. The Earth cannot even be called a grain of sand in this infinity. Before all these worlds, ask yourself, what are your aims and hopes, your intentions and means of fulfilling them, the demands that may be made upon you, and your preparedness to meet them. A long and difficult journey is before you. You are preparing for a strange and unknown land. Do not reckon on trying to come back. The experiment may cost you very dear, and that relates to the Gurdjieff's warning that I mentioned at the beginning. Over to you, Gwen.
Well, I want to open it up for questions and comments before we start with the exercise. We have plenty of time to answer questions. They all say it differently. I say Gurdjieff.
There are, yeah. I've heard it pronounced many different ways, but from the people closest to Gurdjieff, who are students of his students, it would often be pronounced Gurdjieff or Gurdjieff or Gurdjieff. I pronounce it Gurdjieff. Either one is correct, but I think Gurdjieff is perhaps closer to the correct pronunciation. There are actually 7 different centers. There's the Instinctive Center, which the body works by itself, runs on its own fuel, so to speak. The Moving Center, which is more intentionally controlled. There is the Sexual Center. There is the Emotional Center. There is the Intellectual Center. And then the higher centers, located in the brain, perhaps towards the front, is higher intellectual and higher emotional. They are supposed to be working all the time in one way or another. And I heard of another higher center called the higher intellectual center. These centers are higher, always working in one way or another. These 3 centers, the higher aspects of it. But we focus usually mostly with the 3 that are very dominant: the emotional, the intellectual, and the moving center. Because those 3 we can work on more directly.
And there's something additional about these centers, and that is that Gurdjieff tells us that almost all of us come in favoring one of the 3 main centers. And you can pretty much guess what you are. Some of us are intellectually oriented, some of us are physically oriented, some of us are emotionally oriented. The way to get into the higher centers is to achieve a balance of the 3 centers. So for those of us who are, let's say, very strong in the intellectual center, Gurdjieff, in his own work with people, would send them out to dig ditches at the prairie so that they could develop their physical center. And the same thing with the other centers. If you're too physically oriented, read a book. Try and understand the intellectual ideas. And perhaps most important, if your emotional center is closed, see if in some way you can open it up. But we want to balance the 3 centers as part of this work.
Right now, I was going to look for a picture I had, or painting. If you notice the driver, the horse, and the carriage, the practical use of this is to look at yourself as the whole. The horse, which is the emotional, the driver is the intellectual, and the moving is the carriage. And all the small eyes are passengers in that carriage. And I'm going to bring that up because this is how you apply the practical parts of this.
And it depends on how old you are. But
that's an easy answer, isn't it?
Well, you can't, for a long time, or for a while, but there's not too much discussion on the sexual center.
Well, I'll tell you too, Harry, they call the sexual center the animal center a lot. So
yes,
your
okay.
animal instinct sometimes drives you, and you know when you were in puberty, your animal instinct drove you totally mad, probably. But, you know,
Right.
who cares? So
Right.
I'm a child of the 60s, and I mean, we were all little animals during the 60s, you know?
Right.
So I hate to say we were all sexual because it wasn't necessarily so, but that animal nature is often used as the moving sexual center.
Yeah. And
Also, in these teachings, we're going to get into the use of energies in order to connect with the higher centers. Now, sexual energy is a very powerful energy, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't use it, that we shouldn't expend it, but we may want to, maybe rationing is the wrong word, but use it in moderation, since you don't want to pour all of your energy out because you want some of this energy within. It is part of the esoteric teaching.
the sexual center is a very, very powerful center, and it has to be taught very carefully and under someone who really knows in order to work consciously on that center. Jeff just mentioned, Harry just described 7 centers. I is talking about the 3 centers. I'm confused. The 7 centers are the 7 centers of the body, but we work most directly with the 3 centers, because those are the 3 that we can work on in life, more directly than the other centers.
Well, the moving center, or the physical center, you mentioned it before, Harry, actually is divided into 3 parts. You got the moving part where you direct the motion of your arm. You have the instinctual part, let's say that the breathing of the body, which is automatic, and then you have the sexual part. But those 3 are all part of the moving
all those centers are working at the same time. It all depends what you are doing in life, because one will be more domineering over the other centers. Each center has an aspect of the other 7 centers, or the other 3 centers, and it depends what you are doing in your life, what you're putting your attention on, and what you are observing. If you are observing a situation in life, trying to separate yourself from that situation by observing and by non-identification, and trying to observe what center that situation is acting on. It takes a lot of practice. This is initially what it means about self-observation. All the centers are working all the time, and one is there's always one that is dominating over the other.
So the sexual center also can get you taken in your personality. It can get you, we talk about that a lot. If you notice this carriage, you notice all the small eyes are in the carriage. It's not such a small eye, but the person is being taken and identified with the eyes.
Right. You could be walking down the street with your neighbor, with your friend, and talking about constructing a house or something, and all of a sudden this pretty girl walks by, and you turn your head. That pretty girl is stealing your attention, and it's activating the sexual center. That's an example.
And then your horses get away from you. And your emotions follow. So, you have to at some point have your driver intact.
Right.
So let guys, and observe from that space. But those are the 3 centers drawn out and Gurdjieff talks about the parable of the carriage, the horse, and the driver.
Well, we should say something about the 2 higher centers that were in the previous drawing. And the higher centers are working in us, but we're not connected to them because they're really not part of the personality. They're part of essence, if you like. Now, how do you distinguish between an ordinary emotion in the emotional center and a higher emotion? You've probably read some religious literature where some of these recluses have described as best they could what the higher emotional center is like. And so while it can't really be written about, it can be experienced.
And learning to observe from your higher centers is really quite the trick. I mean, that is where you connect to essence. So much of your higher centers, for the normal man, the sleeping humanity, we're not operating from that higher center. So part of studying Gurdjieff and some of the practical exercises to develop these higher centers to a better place. And I'm going to go ahead, we're at the hour, I'm going to talk about the exercise that I would like for y'all to try to do this week. And I am going to read this because and at the end of each chapter of Sy's book is an exercise. Plus, we're going to have exercises out of the appendix, isn't it, Sy, at the end of the book? Don't you have other exercises?
Yes, there are hundreds of exercises.
Yeah, well,
maybe.
We're not going to do 100, but we're going to get close, okay, guys? So get ready. And exercising consciousness, putting ourselves in the other person's place, because the fourth way is a way of life. It's practice in the midst of life. Students of the teaching engage in inner exercises which need not be known to other people. Many exercises were given by Gurdjieff himself. I'm going to skip to the second paragraph. An exercise that Gurdjieff emphasized more than any other is to strive to put oneself in the position of another being. And during this next week, I want you to observe yourself when you're with someone else. Try to put yourself in the place of the other person. Not as your projection, but try to sit in their shoes. Walk in their shoes. See where they're coming from. And you can choose somebody that's easy for you. I happen to choose people that are very difficult for me to understand and that I get in arguments with all the time. So I try to get into the shoes of where they're coming from in order to observe myself. Because once I get into an argument, I'm reacting and I've already lost myself. So we're going to do this exercise, at least try to find somebody you can practice on. And the harder it is to do, the better off you are. So, don't just choose somebody that's so easy for you to understand. I'm going to ask that you all also read lesson number 2, and I will get off some high points of that for next week. Nobody is going to be better than the other, guys. It's the way that that's the one great thing in the Gurdjieff work. Nobody does it perfectly. No one has this perfect self-observation.
It's not unusual for people to have no questions. But having questions and sharing your experiences with the tasks is a way of paying back, so we all can grow, and that way we all share in that experience.
I'd like to just share something about this exercise and how helpful I find it. I find it just amazing, but I don't always remember to do it, and that's the kind of tricky thing about it. But when I get into a situation, I find that I'm feeling irritated or annoyed or something, I'm not feeling at peace. If I'm able to catch myself, and we didn't talk a whole lot about how to observe oneself, but if I'm noticing in myself that I'm having this emotion that I don't really want, if I can catch it and do what this exercise is suggesting, it just turns things into really amazing results. To put myself in the position of another person and wonder what they're even thinking, and when I do that, I realize that it's probably just me that was irritated. They were probably not doing something to hurt me. It just happened that I took it that way. So it's really been a helpful exercise for me.
Thanks, Carol. I want to mention that I'm reading. Miguel sent a question. He said the mention of a driver, horse, and carriage reminds me of Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, and that's exactly where it comes from. So, is it an intentional allegory or just a coincidence? You've got to remember that Gurdjieff also traveled in the Far East, so he's picked up a lot of the imagery from Persia, from Turkey, from Afghanistan, the Sufis. What I'm also encouraging y'all to do, there is a free, you can watch Meetings with Remarkable Men, which is really the story of Gurdjieff's travels, on YouTube. And I think it would be very helpful for you just to watch the YouTube presentation. So it's a documentary, or not a documentary, but an acting out of that. And they use a lot of the terms that we're going to use. So,
and connecting this with the Bhagavad Gita, as you've done, and with these ancient traditions, we should all realize, especially those of us with some theosophical background, Gurdjieff didn't just show up out of the blue. In fact, some of us think he was sent in. Some of us think he was a master. You could argue about that. But what might be interesting for those of you who are theosophists is that the Mahatma letters, which are core documents of the Theosophical Society, were owned, edited, and published by two of Gurdjieff's students while they were at the Priory in 1922 and 23, Mort Hoffman and Trevor Barker. So he's part of a great tradition. Blavatsky predicted somebody would come in the 20th century and bring the teaching in a practical way, because a lot of what she brought is more difficult to understand. So these things are all connected.
Thank you, Sy, and this is the end of our first session. So thank you all for being with us.